Hey everyone, welcome to another episode about how to write clean code in .NET Core. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about dependency injection. All right. So in this sample application, this is a template application where I have gone ahead and added a services folder. There is no accounts, no database, just a plain old application. What I want to go over is how to register your dependencies and what you can do to basically make that process easier. Because let's say we have a couple of services, maybe you have 10, and you're okay with registering them individually. So you would go into startup and you would do something like services, add transient, service 1, and this one. And you would do something like that, and then you would do the same for service 2. And then you would go into your page wherever you need it, somewhere here, and then say from services we can take service 1, and then do the same for service 2, and then we can do something like service 1 dot get, and all get does, just so you know, it will just return a string and what kind of service and where it's coming from. Okay, so you could do something like that. Let's generate this type. I'm gonna go ahead and display this on my page. Private, make this public. Okay, let's refresh this. Really run this again. All right, and there you can see the message from service 1, and then if I wanted to, I could replace this with service 2, or I can have both the messages running in parallel. So let me rerun this. And there you can see it. Okay, so hopefully you get the picture. Sometimes you can have a couple of services, like 3 or 4. Sometimes you can have 100. And imagine having 100 lines written in here, or you might have separate files. Basically, the point is, every time you create a new service, you will have to register it, right? So that's an extra step, that's repetition that you might not want to do. So this tutorial is going to be about how you want to go ahead and get rid of that repetition. So what we essentially want to achieve is we want to create a class that will find the services that we want, and then be able to automatically add these services to our dependency injection container. So let's remove this. Let's go into the base of the folder services, and let's create a new file. We'll call it register services.cs. Okay, so for this, I'm actually gonna change the namespace since this is the convention. So we're gonna change to Microsoft extensions dependency injection. Okay, and then we can use public. We can make this class static, and then I'm gonna create a public static void, and this is going to be add standalone services. So I have two types of services. So standalone services, which I decorate with an attribute, and this is how I'm going to recognize that it's a service and I want to register it. The second type of services I have is I have an interface service, right? So I have an interface and I have some kind of service inheriting from that interface. Okay, so I'm going to show you how to do it for both of them. So let's go ahead and type in this, and I service collection, and this. So what service collection is if we go to the startup, this service collection is an iService collection. So this is how we add stuff to our dependency injection containers. So this is essentially just the same object. What we want to do here is we want to somehow recognize the type of the service. Well, this is going to be adding the standalone services. So what we want to do is we want to scan our application for classes that contain this attribute. Okay. The way you achieve this is you use something called reflection. If you're familiar with it, you will be in a comfort zone. If you're not, you will be like, what is going on? But hopefully it will all make sense. So first of all, let's grab a type, and the type I will take is the attribute type. So let's actually call this attribute type. So I'm going to say type of, and I'm going to say service. Okay, so service is this class, and this is an attribute. Okay, and every single attribute, every single class is contained within an assembly, and the assembly is this project. Okay, so then what I want to do is I want to take attribute type, assembly, and then grab defined types. So defined types are all the types in your assembly. So this is going to be a list of types. So we can actually go ahead and say defined types. And actually, let's go ahead a step further and let's say assembly here. I'm going to say, we're going to take this, put it here. I'm going to take assembly, put it here. And then I'm going to just make an assignment statement so I can break point here. I'm going to go to my startup. I'm going to go to services. And since I added it to the namespace of Microsoft extension, this dependency injection, this is something we already import here. So I don't need to have another using statement. All I can do is add standalone services. Okay, just like that. All right, so I have my breakpoint here. Let's go ahead and try to run this and see what it gives us. So let me remove this breakpoint. Okay, so attribute type, not a lot of information, well, a lot of information here, but essentially, if you just poke around, you will be able to see that the base type is attribute, so this is system.attribute, so this is something that the service is inheriting from. So if I go here, I can see that it's inheriting from an attribute. All right, so that's the base type. So you can get a feel of what kind of information is contained within these data types. Okay, so you can find out if the class is abstract, if it's a reference, if it's a class, if it's an enum, if it's a generic type, etc. So reflection is basically a way for your program to know about itself, something similar to self-awareness, but not real self-awareness, because we are basically telling it how to be self-aware. Moving forward, this attribute type, we have an assembly right here, and this is this object here, and this is all the information about the application. All right, because our application gets compiled into assembly, and so this is basically our assembly, and our assembly can have all the defined types. So we have 13. And you can see we have the program class, the startup class, the services that I've created, the interfaces, the error model, index model. So these are our page models, and this register services class itself. Okay, so now from this list of classes, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to extract the services that have the attribute of service. All right, so for this, I'm going to go into my defined types, and what I want to grab from here are my services. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and say where, right? So I'm going to take all my services. So I want to say type. So for every single type, we want to find out if it has an attribute. So let's go say type, get type info. So sometimes if you don't do get type info, for this we'll need to import using system reflection. So if you sometimes don't do this, not all information is going to be grabbed from the type. Preferably, if something is going wrong or not expected, always call get type info on the type. Okay, and in here we want to grab get custom attribute. So this is this is an extension method from systems reflection. So if you don't have access to this method, make sure you're using a systems reflection. Okay, let me pop this to a new line. In here, I want to say service. All right, so I'm going to get a custom attribute of type service. Now, obviously, some of the classes are not going to have the type service attribute that they are decorated with. So this is where we're basically filtering, right? So this will have to be not null. Let's close this off. Okay, so let me do this step again. Let me put a breakpoint here. Let me run this. Okay, and now let's check a look at our services, and we have a list of 2 services, service 1 and service 2. Great. All right, so now all we can do is go ahead and create a for each loop, and I'm going to say var service and services. I'm going to say add this, add transient, and inside of here I will supply the service that I want to add. Voila. Now let's go ahead and run our application, but actually wait, before that I will go ahead and create a second, let me put these into paragraphs, and I will call this 2, and in my backend here I will go ahead and create a second one so we can see them work at the same time. So let's go ahead and run this. And there we can see that our services are basically added automatically. And if I would have gone ahead and created a service 3, let's say 3, and then I would have I'll just copy the class, replace service 2 with service 3. I'm not going to worry about renaming it. If I'm going to run this again, you can see that it's registered automatically, and I don't actually need to go on and add anything into my startup class. I can just rely on this bit of code to grab these services for me automatically. One cool little trick here as well is, chances are if you are going to be implementing this strategy, you might have your services living in a separate library. So this is what this library in this folder is about. I have essentially duplicated these services in here, right? So what we can do is we can supply the type to this function, and we can grab the assembly from that type, right? So let's say that we want to just pass in some kind of type in here, and we'll have to get using system. We are going to replace the type of with the type that we're passing. And here, let me just rename this to just T. Okay, so now when we go to startup, if I will go ahead and I will say type of service, I'll be careful to use my library standalone services attribute. So this one here is in some library standalone services, so it's this class here. So there is some ambiguous ambiguity, so it probably doesn't know, it basically can't tell the difference. So I'm basically going to be a little bit explicit in how I specify the type. Okay, so now what I'm doing is I'm passing in the type as a parameter, and I can basically dynamically say from which assembly I want to load in my services. Okay, so you might have 2 different libraries, and you want to register services from those 2 different libraries. Maybe you have different types of services, etc. But okay, let's go ahead and see this work. One thing I'll need to do is I'm going to need to scrap this import here. I'm going to change this back to service 2, and I'm going to import using standalone services from my library. I'm going to go ahead and run this. So what this should change to is service 1 and service 2 from library. So no services were found. Let's go ahead and see what this is about. Okay, so library is good. Get custom attribute. Okay, so I'm using the service that is inside a different assembly. Okay, so what I actually want to do is scrap this using here, and I want to use the service from some library, right? So this is just, you're probably not going to be running into these issues. It's just because I have defined the same classes in two projects. So it's a little bit confusing, but as you can see, this service is now being imported from the library, the library rather than the application itself. So now let's go over another type of services. I'm gonna go ahead into the interface services, right? So we have an interface that has a get, and basically it does similar things. So I have an iService, I have an interface service 2 and 1, which basically says interface service from service 1 from app, and alternatively same thing in my library. Okay, so let's go ahead into the register services, and let's create another public static void add interfaced services. Okay, I'm going to pass in this iService collection, add this. I'm not going to worry about passing in the type yet. All I want to do is basically say I'm going to get the interface services from here. Okay, so let's grab this breakpoint, and what we're going to do, we're going to do the same thing. So let's actually copy this part here, and instead of the type here, we want to say type of iService, so an interface service, and I'm going to grab it from this application. So, and instead of attribute type, I'm going to rename this to interface type. So now all we have to do is we have to go ahead and do a similar thing. So we have to go into services, and we'll say define the types, and we'll again use link for where, t for type, and now we want to say t get type info. And what we want to do is say is interface and not. So we don't want to check for interfaces first. Then we want to go ahead and say t.get type info implemented interfaces .count is more than 0. So this is going to eliminate all the classes that don't have an interface. This is going to prevent some errors in the next query. So then we're going to go ahead and get type info again. And what we're going to do is we're going to basically call implemented interfaces, call first or default, right? So otherwise this would have had returned null. Let me drop this to a new line. And then I want to get type info of this object. And I want to make sure that it is equals to interface type. So again, check that the current class we're looking is not an interface. So we're only going to get concrete classes like this one. Next thing, we're checking that this concrete class has an interface. So we're doing this check to make sure that once we do get an interface, this is not going to break, because when we call get type info on a null, it's going to throw an exception. So, okay, now we have our services. Let's go and do the same thing for each. And let's actually, I'll grab this. But this time we have an interface. So what we need to do is go ahead and say interface type here. And now it's going to register the interface and its implementation. Let's go ahead and put a breakpoint here. Let's not forget to services add interface services. Okay. Let's run this. And let's see our services. So result view. And here we see our two interface service 1 and interface service 2. Okay, so let me stop this because I'm not yet importing them. I'm going to go ahead into my index model here. Now, this situation is a little bit trickier because usually you would implement an interface, but here we have an interface with two different implementations. So I want to show you how to go about handling that as well. Let's bring up our HTTP context. I want to get request services, and I want to get services, and then I want to import extension for dependency injection from Microsoft, and then I can supply a type of iService. So this is the type of service that I'm going to be getting. I'm going to go ahead and remove all of this gunk. I'm going to say var services equals this. Let me drop this to a new line. All right, and now what I want to do is get service 1 equals services. Where I'm going to import the link for this, and services service. I want to get type. I want to say that this type equals to type of whatever service I want to get. So I'm going to say int service 1, like so. And actually, because this is still going to give me an enumerable, I'm going to actually change this to first. Okay, let's put a semicolon here. Let's do the same for this one. Service 2, and now let's go ahead and say service 1.get 2 equals service 2.get. Cool. Well, let's run this. This guy over here. Let me break the breakpoint. And there you can see that it's interface service from service 1 from app, and interface service 2 from app as well. So this will basically conclude this episode. If you've been following along, I will challenge you to go ahead and write the implementation to register the interface services from the assembly. This is a good example to practice your reflection skills and attribute skills as well. So I'm not putting up the code for this. Rewatch the video, type it out, get the muscle memory in. Hope you enjoyed this episode. Thanks for watching. Hopefully you learned a lot. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. I'd like to answer them. If you're new to the channel, I have a lot more .NET Core content coming up, so make sure you subscribe. Like the video, check out my other videos, and hopefully I'll see you around. Have a good day.